Workwear, an aesthetic and pretty versatile way of dressing that has been relevant to American culture going back to at least the 1950s with greasers, and maybe even further back with merchant seamen who wore denim in the 18th century. As art's supposed to mimic reality, adding workwear to your arsenal of different outfits you can draw can be extremely useful, as you can use outfits to describe characters without the need for any words whatsoever. Now, as always, what I choose to do in videos is largely based off areas of my own art I wish to improve, as well as what you guys comment down below. So, seeing as I was tired of drawing half-naked men, I decided this week we're gonna go over outfits. So I figure the best place to start is with the 1950s greaser look. Now, I don't know if this is actually a part of workwear, if it's a slightly different aesthetic, but what I do know is it fills a similar niche, right? What I always recommend before you start drawing an outfit is to get at least a skeleton or a base of a figure before you start going in with the details. And using this frame to inform how we're gonna draw our folds. Areas where the clothing is going to bunch up and squeeze, and areas where the clothing is going to be allowed to flow down simply because the figure is that way. As for individual clothing items, what we're going to start with is a classic white tee, any type of looser fitting pants, a belt of some kind, a thick leather jacket, some kind of work boot, or like sneaker from the 1950s, and some lingerie. Now, in fashion as well as art, there's something called the rule of thirds, which in this setting is when we're gonna have the top third of our figure cut off by the belt and the t-shirt, and the bottom 2/3 are gonna be the pants as well as the shoes. Now, the reason to do this is because it creates the illusion of making your figure look taller, right? Good tip for any of you who are under 6 feet. This is something you could do to just slightly upgrade your wardrobe. Now, because we're trying to achieve this rule of thirds, we're gonna cut off our figure along the 1/3 mark with our belt, tuck in the shirt. How chunky you want to make the belt is up to you. I'm going with something pretty standard. For these thicker, looser type of pants, we're not going to show off too much of the figure's legs, right? That's more characteristic of skinny jeans, and these are closer to straight or looser fit jeans. However, the shape of the leg is going to help us with drawing some of these folds. We'll add some minor, smaller folds right here just because he's packing, and then some larger, looser folds towards the knees. Once we get to the bottom of the leg, we're going to actually bunch up the fabric of the pants just a little bit because it's on top of the work boot, right? Now, if drawing folds isn't the most intuitive thing to you, I almost always recommend looking at reference while you're drawing. Now, there's a pretty specific type of leather jacket worn by greasers, which features some chunky zippers as well as this specific collar right here. Now, because I'm drawing this with ink, I decided there are some things I'm going to simplify and exaggerate. For instance, this zipper here isn't actually too accurate to reality, and if you have a little bit more commitment to realism, feel free to draw on each zipper by itself. But at the scale at which I'm drawing this figure, I feel this is the best way of going about it. Other things you might want to include when you're drawing this style of jacket is some bright silver buttons. That's just going to pop out the contrast of a mostly black jacket. As for the nitty-gritty of what folds I'm using, I'm having some tighter V folds from the armpit to the shoulder, as well as some looser J folds on the arm. As for ways I'm drawing this specific to the medium, I'm focusing on the negative space for my blackouts, right? Leather jackets are mainly black, which is why I actually chose to do ink in the first place, but that means I'm going to be a little limited in the amount of gray values I can create. Now, there's a few different ways you can create gray values with ink. There's drawing a bunch of little dots called stippling, or you could do cross-hatching. And I really didn't find either was too compelling for the texture of leather. Now, if it was more of a tumbled leather instead of like a smooth leather, you could put in these creases, and it's actually not the most difficult thing to create a gray value for. But what I eventually landed on was just going for some solid highlights. And maybe if the jacket was like 3 feet in front of the camera, we could go into the nitty-gritty of like the textures of leather. But I figure since at this viewing distance, it's perfectly fine just to leave some bright highlights as well as some simple dark shapes. Another tip to help you when inking, which isn't strictly necessary, but it's just going to help you be a little bit less messy, is if you're right-handed, start at the top left of the drawing when inking, and then make your way down to the right. This is to make sure you don't go over areas that you've already inked. Specifically when you're working with a dip pen, this is especially true, because microns and these technical pens, they tend to dry a lot quicker than actual India ink. And the worst thing you want to do is be in the middle of a drawing, you're grinding out the details, and then you have to put it down for like 2 hours and let the ink cure. Alright, for the next drawing, we're going to be going with a Pacific Northwest lager. It's a slightly different look than the last one we just did, which may include some type of Henley shirt, maybe like a flannel, some type of hat, potentially even overalls. And what's very characteristic about this is thick leather boots. Overalls contain what's called a diaper fold. So I just have a shirt right here, and what a diaper fold is, you see right now it's stretched out, right? It's supported by 2 points. And what a diaper fold is when you allow the fabric to droop a little in the middle. There's also going to be some slight tightening of the fabric around the waistband, which isn't characteristic of every type of overalls, but is a choice I decided for this drawing specifically. Make sure you're giving three-dimensional space to every part of the drawing, including the pockets, right? It's just going to make it a little bit more believable, even though I'm just sketching this. I'm not very committed to realism in this specific one. Now, I figure this outfit looks a little bit too farmer boy-like, so I'm just going to go in and throw some background details just to really solidify that, yes, this is a logger, not a farmer, right? It's very interesting because the same outfit in different settings implies different things, right? And I think the reason why this is very similar to a farmer boy aesthetic is that these are clothes meant to be worked in, right? They need some level of quality to them and are probably just staples that they had. Probably what I think you should focus on if you really want to get that Pacific Northwestern logger aesthetic, you got to get the pair of work boots, correct? So if you want specific models, I recommend you just go to Red Wing and look at their heritage lines. Most of these will pass for logger boots. As for the pants, we're doing it pretty much the same as we did for the last one. They're on the looser end, closer to straight fit jeans. If you want, feel free to go wider, but me personally, I just don't think that's necessary. Now, Henley shirts aren't really too bad to draw. It's just a basic long sleeve with a few buttons down the collar. You could roll it up, which is going to cause a bunch of interlocking folds around the elbow. Or you could just allow it to hang down, which is going to cause fewer but larger and looser folds. What's important to remember is you want to keep in mind the time period for when you're actually drawing, right? If you're drawing something from 1950, they're probably going to be wearing slightly different technology and outfits as someone from like 2010, for example. For example, in like an old Western setting, you wouldn't put sneakers on a character, right? Because there's not the modern manufacturing techniques that allow that to happen. All right, so I'm going on to my last example, which is going to be more of a modern iteration of workwear aesthetics, right? So let's quickly go over what we've learned from the previous examples, right? Workwear is generally characterized by comfortable, looser fitting clothing that are thick and have decent quality behind them. Very commonly, you'll see characters wearing some type of jacket on the thicker end. And for this one specifically, I decided to go with a basic Carhartt jacket. This is a pretty universal jacket that you could apply to any scenario. It's not like job specific. Moreover, we're not having super tight fitting jeans, right? These are towards the looser end, maybe a pair of cargos or carpenter pants. All of it works perfectly fine. And depending on what time period you're in, you want to have the appropriate technology for whenever it takes place. Now, you're probably not here for fashion tips, and I'm definitely not the guy to give them to you. But hopefully recognizing some of the common patterns you see in workwear is going to allow you to apply them to your own creative scenarios. For instance, let's say you have something that takes place in the future. You could use current workwear trends and a little bit more futuristic, right? Either way, you should have a solid repertoire of different clothing items you can draw. Hopefully after this video you feel a little bit more comfortable drawing workwear. If you guys appreciated the amount of time and effort that went into this video, feel free to subscribe. Also, we're going to be having a video of how to draw hands in the top left, right, wherever it is. Feel free to check that out. And with that said, goodbye.